Spain, late 15th century. Fresh from the Reconquista, the kingdom looks like a victor. Granada has fallen, and the Catholic monarchs, Ferdinand and Isabella, have proclaimed the lands united. Nearly the entire Iberian Peninsula now bows to their rule. But along with military victory came a new order. The state decided that one faith and one obedience mattered more than a patchwork of traditions and beliefs. Thousands of Jews and Muslims were given a choice: be baptized or leave. Many accepted baptism, but trust did not follow. These people were labeled new Christians, and suspicion whispered that their rituals were only for show, that behind closed doors they kept living as before. That suspicion became the soil where a special court took root, the Inquisition. In 1478, Pope Sixtus IV granted Spain the right to establish its own Inquisition, independent of Rome. Its task was to find heretics and punish those who strayed from true faith. Very quickly, however, it became a tool of political control. Inquisitors wielded near unlimited power. They could summon anyone, interrogate, detain, seize property. Fear of them was so deep that a neighbor's whisper could send a person to prison. Towns and villages lived in the shadow of suspicion. People murmured at night about who had prayed too quietly last Sunday, who hadn't crossed himself when a procession passed, whose table bore a suspicious dish. Accusation became part of the system, and inquisitors recorded every small detail. Trials unfolded in stages. First, the accused was summoned and pressed for a confession. If they denied the charge, interrogation followed. The Inquisition believed the truth could be drawn out by force. So, the executioner's toolkit became an integral part of the judicial process. Torture was not viewed as cruelty, but as a means of purification. Pain of the body was supposed to lead to salvation of the soul. Interrogations took place in tribunal basements, where stone walls held the echoes of screams and every instrument had its purpose. Some were meant to force a quick admission, others to grind a person down slowly. Dry formulas survive in the records: 3 cups of water applied, 4 turns of the screw, held until first fainting. The Inquisition did not always aim to kill. Its primary goal was a spoken confession made in public, so the whole community could hear a person denounce himself. For that, you needed methods that broke the will but left the body alive. That's why Spanish archives contain so many references to torture, from practices used across Europe to instruments that became, for this era, symbols of a darker order. Before us stretches an arsenal made not to kill, but to compel. Methods that mix crude simplicity with perverse refinement. Each one is a step toward breaking a human being, turning him into a witness against himself. These are the tools and the practices we're about to examine. The strapado was one of the most commonly used methods of interrogation in Spain during the 16th and 17th centuries. The victim's arms were tied behind the back, and they were hoisted up by the wrists with a rope running over a pulley or beam. Sometimes weights were tied to the feet to increase the strain. Even short suspensions caused shoulders to dislocate and ligaments to tear. Trial records note that after being subjected to the strapado, many prisoners could no longer move their arms on their own. Its popularity came from its simplicity. All it required was a rope and a beam, which meant the strapado could be set up in virtually any cellar. Inquisitors valued it because it rarely resulted in death, allowing them to reach their main goal, extracting a confession and forcing a public act of repentance. There were variations in how it was used. Sometimes the victim was jerked up and down in quick pulls to produce shock. Other times, the suspension lasted for hours. Adding weights made the tearing of joints permanent. The strapado appears in a large number of Inquisition case files, which shows it was not an unusual measure, but a routine part of the investigative process. In 16th-17th century Europe, the breaking wheel was one of the most notorious forms of public execution. Convicted murderers, rapists, traitors, or highway robbers sentenced to the wheel were brought onto a scaffold, laid out before the crowd, and tied down. The execution wheel itself was usually just a large wooden cartwheel with thick spokes, the same kind used on wagons and carriages. The first stage was not about killing, but about mutilating the body. With a heavy wheel rim or an iron bar, the executioner smashed the bones of the condemned, typically starting with the legs and arms before moving up toward the shoulders. To intensify the injuries, wooden blocks with sharp edges were placed beneath the joints, so every strike caused a compound break. In the second stage, the broken body was woven into the wheel's spokes or tied directly to it. Shattered limbs bent easily into the gaps between the spokes. The wheel was then raised high on a pole and displayed to the crowd. The condemned lay face up, left to die from shock, dehydration, and exposure. Often conscious for hours, sometimes even days, birds pecked at the helpless victim, adding to the torment. In some cases, a wooden frame or a simple cross of beams was used in place of a wheel, but the spectacle and slow death remained the same. Picture this. You're led into a narrow cell, your hands bound. The inquisitor reads the charges: heresy, blasphemy, secret gatherings. You deny them, but the guards force you onto a bench. The executioner arrives with jugs of water and a strip of cloth. A rag is laid across your face, your mouth pried open with a wooden wedge. Then the water begins to pour. It flows steadily into your throat until your lungs convulse in search of air. Your body arches, your breath is stolen, and death feels a moment away. Panic drives you to gasp at emptiness, but every attempt to breathe brings more water instead of air. In the records of the Inquisition, this method was a form of water torture. It was called toca, from the Spanish word for cloth. It became one of the Inquisition's favored techniques because it left almost no visible marks but created overwhelming terror of drowning. 16th century trial notes often read like this: the prisoner confessed after 3 jugs of water. Deaths did occur, especially when the victim lost consciousness and suffocated. But more often, survivors of the water cure were ready to sign whatever was demanded of them. Dozens of Inquisition case files preserve confessions extracted through this method. Thumb screws were a small iron device made of 2 plates tightened together with a screw. Fingers, sometimes thumbs, sometimes multiple digits, were placed between the plates while the interrogator turned the screw slowly. Pressure could be increased in tiny increments, so the pain climbed from a sharp sting to the crushing of joints and nails. On the inner faces of the device, there were often short spikes or serrations to make the agony more intense and to break bone more easily. 16th and 17th century sources note that thumb screws were used where a quick push toward confession was needed. Unlike the strapado, they didn't demand a special chamber. The instrument could be kept in the executioner's chest and used almost anywhere. For the inquisitor, they were practical, discreet, easy to apply, and terrifying enough that the memory of the pain alone often loosened tongues. Iron bands were clamped around the shin. Wooden wedges were hammered in between the strips, each blow driving the wood deeper, forcing the metal tighter against the bone. First the muscles tore, then the joint gave way, and finally came the crack. The leg reduced to splinters. In some versions, screws replaced wedges. The executioner turned them slowly, and the iron itself cut into the bone. The Spanish boot was not unique to the Inquisition. Variations of the device appeared in Germany, France, and Scotland. But Spanish records of the 16th century mention it most often as a tool for stubborn prisoners. It was easy to build and came in many forms: wooden, iron, or mixed. A harsher version had a top plate lined with spikes, so every turn or strike drove metal points straight into the flesh. Surviving descriptions note that after just a few wedges, the victim could no longer stand, and after a full tightening, he was left crippled for life. The garrote was not an instrument of interrogation, but of execution. It was used in Spain for centuries, including during the age of the Inquisition. The condemned was seated or tied to a post, an iron collar or loop fastened around the neck. Behind the chair or post was a screw mechanism. As the executioner slowly turned the handle, the screw pressed into the base of the skull or tightened the collar, crushing the spine and cutting off breath. It was reserved for those sentenced to die, but whose punishment did not call for the public spectacle of burning. Strangulation or a broken neck was seen as a cleaner way to carry out justice. The garrote's origins lay in older methods of rope or cord strangulation, but the Spanish design distinguished itself with mechanical precision. The screw allowed the executioner to control the pressure and pace, making the death grimly efficient and more easily managed. The heretic's fork was a small iron rod tipped with two sets of sharp prongs. One pair pressed up beneath the chin, the other dug into the chest or the base of the throat. Straps around the head and neck held it firmly in place, preventing the victim from lowering his head or falling asleep. Any attempt to relax drove the points deeper into the flesh. This device didn't kill quickly and didn't leave the same obvious mutilation as other tortures. Its purpose was exhaustion, keeping the prisoner in constant tension. More often than not, the fork was used not during interrogation but afterward, ensuring the accused stayed awake, helpless, and consumed by fear. Among the most invisible forms of torture were stress positions, forcing a person to hold the body in one fixed posture for hours. No elaborate equipment was required. Ropes, stocks, or a simple order from the guards were enough. A prisoner might be forced to kneel on stone floors while holding a heavy cross or rock in his hands. Any movement risked dropping it and brought harsher punishment. Another variant was binding the arms behind the back and tying them to an overhead beam so tightly that the victim had to balance on tiptoe. Unable to hang freely, the body fought against the burning ache in every muscle. Spanish records also describe squatting torture, where the accused had to hold a crouch with thighs nearly parallel to the ground. Within minutes, the legs gave way, but standing up was forbidden. For women, one version involved hours of standing barefoot on sun-heated stone, the skin slowly searing under the weight of the body. The torture chair was a heavy wooden seat, studded with hundreds of iron spikes across the seat, backrest and armrests. The victim was strapped in tightly, often naked or in thin clothing, with leather belts holding every limb in place. Any attempt to shift drove the spikes deeper into the flesh. Sometimes a brazier was placed beneath the chair, heating the iron points until the static torment turned into searing burns. Across Europe, there were several variations of this device. In Germany, versions included footrests and head clamps to immobilize the victim completely. In Italy, descriptions mention chairs with screw presses attached to the armrests, crushing fingers or feet while the body remained pinned against the spikes, combining multiple methods into one ordeal. You're led into a narrow cell, seated at a table, and ordered to lay out your hands. Bones aren't broken, not yet, but every tool in sight promises pain you won't forget. These were small, targeted torments, used one after another to wear down resistance. Hot pincers slid beneath a fingernail, tearing it out in a burst of sharp agony, leaving weeks of throbbing pain. This was a quick way to break someone's will. Metal tongs or rods heated to white hot were pressed against the skin, searing flesh in an instant. The smell of burning lingered, and the scar remained as a brand of shame. Sometimes executioners used thin iron rods for pinpoint burns, to the fingers, ears, or soles of the feet. Small marks, fierce pain, and a constant risk of infection. Clamps on the tongue or lips made every movement unbearable, stripping the victim of speech and dignity alike. And then there were the spikes and needles, pressed into the skin under clothing or into sensitive spots. The pain was relentless, but outward signs were minimal, the torment hidden, the suffering deep. Known as the Spanish spider, the iron spider, or the breast ripper, this was a brutal instrument designed to shred, tear, or rip away flesh. Most often the breasts, but also the abdomen, groin, buttocks, or other soft parts of the body. In historical memory, it became most notorious for its use against women accused of witchcraft. Inquisitors in Spain were said to tear at women's chests with it, though the device was by no means limited to alleged witches. The Spanish spider was a set of iron claws, usually 4 sharp prongs curved like talons. It could be used cold or heated until glowing red, depending on how much torment the executioner intended to inflict. With either method, the result was agony, disfigurement, and often permanent mutilation. The rack was a mechanical device built to stretch the human body. It looked like a long wooden frame with a roller or winch at one end and restraints for wrists and ankles at both. The accused was laid on his back, arms and legs locked into the loops. Then the executioner turned the roller or cranked the mechanism, pulling the body tighter and tighter. The spine arched, joints were wrenched from their sockets, and muscles tore under the strain. In harsher versions, extra weights were tied to the legs or arms, or the device itself was reinforced to speed up the breaking point. There were variations. Some racks worked with hand cranks, others with lever systems. Some included spikes to add localized pain. A softer method involved pausing or loosening the tension occasionally to keep the victim conscious. The practice was widespread. Racks appeared both in royal courts and in inquisitorial chambers. Still, the Inquisition often reserved it for the most stubborn prisoners or those seen as especially dangerous to order. In Spain during the Inquisition, there was a method that required no iron or elaborate machinery. The accused was forced to swallow liquids meant to disgust or sicken them. Sometimes it was heavily salted or bitter water, vinegar, spoiled wine, or mixtures laced with pepper and herbs. In some accounts, even filth and excrement were used. This form of torture left no obvious wounds but worked on several levels. First came the physical suffering, stomach pain, choking, vomiting. Then the humiliation, the victim reduced to helplessness while guards asserted their dominance. And finally, the psychological collapse, stripped of dignity. The prisoner was far more likely to give in and confess. The prayer cross was a torture device shaped like a crucifix, to which the victim was chained as if bound to a cross. Beneath it, executioners placed a brazier, and the fire slowly roasted the victim from below. The prayer cross is believed to have appeared at the turn of the 12th, 17th centuries, most likely in Austria. Evidence comes from a reference in the book Justice of the Past, preserved in the Criminal Museum of Rothenburg, Germany. The author describes one such cross once kept in the tower of Salzburg Castle in Austria. During the time of the Inquisition, one method sometimes used was the wooden horse, a device simple in appearance but brutal in effect. It was a long beam with a sharp wedge-like top set on supports. The victim was forced to straddle it as if riding a saddle, but the entire weight of the body pressed down on the narrow edge. To intensify the pain, weights were often tied to the victim's legs. This forced the body deeper onto the sharp ridge, making the agony unbearable. Prolonged sitting tore skin and muscle in the groin and thighs, often causing bleeding. Some accounts note that prisoners fainted from the pain before they were even removed from the device. Historical records show that similar constructions were used beyond Spain as well. In France and Italy, where city authorities sometimes employed the wooden horse as punishment for thieves or unruly soldiers. The knee splitter was designed to shatter joints, most often the knees, but also the elbows. It was a heavy iron clamp made of two halves lined with sharp spikes. The device was fastened around the joint, and as the executioner tightened the screws, the halves closed in. The spikes bit deeper and deeper, crushing cartilage, splitting bone, and tearing flesh. Some versions use smooth iron plates that simply compress the joint, causing dislocations and fractures. But the spiked model was far more common, as it not only crippled, but also left ghastly open wounds. Chronicles note that after undergoing the knee splitter, a victim would never walk properly again. The head crusher was a device built to slowly destroy the skull. It consisted of a metal frame with a lower plate for the chin and an upper plate tightened by a screw. As the executioner turned the handle, the chin was forced upward while the forehead and back of the head were pressed down under increasing pressure. At first, the teeth cracked and the jaw splintered. As the screw tightened further, the skull itself began to give way. At a certain point, the eyes bulged from their sockets, a sight that made the torture especially terrifying for onlookers. Some versions included spikes on the inner plates to hasten the destruction and make the results even bloodier. Historians note that this device was confirmed mainly in Northern Europe, where it appeared in city prisons as part of interrogation. Mentions in Spain are less frequent, so its direct link to the Inquisition remains debated. Still, the head crusher became one of the enduring symbols of the torture chamber, displayed in 19th century collections as an example of engineered cruelty. The Judas cradle was a wooden or metal pyramid mounted on a tripod. The accused was suspended by ropes and slowly lowered so that the point of the pyramid pressed into the perineum or the anal area. The weight of the body pulled downward, and every movement increased the pain. Sometimes weights were tied to the victim's legs to speed the process. In some versions, the executioner could raise and lower the prisoner repeatedly, prolonging the ordeal for hours. With prolonged use, tissues tore, bleeding began, and infections followed. 19th century descriptions even mention refined models with a hollow core, through which liquids or objects could be passed to intensify the torment. The device is known from accounts and museum exhibits across Europe. Its main effect combined physical agony with humiliation, the victim forced into a degrading position, utterly unable to move. The hanging cage was a metal lattice just large enough to squeeze a person inside, but too small to allow lying down or much movement. It was suspended from poles at city gates, from towers, or near market squares. Once locked inside, the victim was left exposed to the elements. By day, the sun beat down. By night, cold and damp set in. Without food or water, the body quickly weakened. The inability to shift position caused swelling and numbness in the limbs. Within days, death came from dehydration, exhaustion, or infection. The public nature of the punishment was part of its design. Birds and dogs preyed on the helpless body, turning suffering into spectacle. Even after death, the corpse might remain in the cage for weeks, decaying in full view. This practice was used not only in Spain, but across much of Europe. The pair of anguish was a metal device shaped like a fruit, divided into several hinged segments. Inside was a screw mechanism. As the executioner turned the handle, the segments spread apart, transforming the smooth cone into a brutal expanding frame. The device was inserted into the mouth, the vagina, or the rectum. Closed, it slid in with relative ease, but with each turn of the screw, the inner leaves spread wider, stretching tissue to the point of tearing. Every twist increased the pain, and rough handling could rupture muscles and cause dangerous internal bleeding. Sources mention the pair of anguish across different parts of Europe. Its effect was not only physical, but deeply humiliating, turning interrogation into an act of degradation. That blend of pain and shame is why the device endured in memory as one of the most terrifying instruments of its age. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to give it a like and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss our next videos. And be sure to check out our other videos where we explore the most mysterious and dark pages of history.